Okay, so welcome on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. I'd like to welcome you. This year's Etta and Milton Levy Scholar in Residence is Professor Mark Leuchter of Temple University, a brilliant scholar and friend, and I am delighted to have him here today. Today he'll be speaking on, in conversation with both myself as well as, we hope, audience members, speaking on Persian Imperial mythology and the origins of Jewish demonology. Before turning it over to Professor Leuchter, I'd like to thank the UCLA Portavid Institute for the study of the Iranian world for their generosity as co-sponsor this event. I also want to thank the Levy Center staff and board for, again, sponsoring today's event and the other Levy events of the quarter. We have a number of events this week. We had one yesterday, but we also have another event that Professor Leuchter will be participating in as well tomorrow and Friday, a conference co-sponsored by the Portavid Institute for the Study of the Ancient Iranian World on the Bible in its ancient Iranian context. So please feel free to see email blasts from the Levy Center, or it'll be in 306, beginning at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Yes. So we'll be focusing on the books of the Hebrew Bible, including Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Daniel. So we hope to see you at those events and look forward to the discussions therein, including Professor Leuchter's work. Again, thank you to the Levy Center staff for making the arrangements for today's event. And before beginning, I'd ask you to please silence your phones, which I am now double-checking myself. So before introducing the general talk, I think it's worth spending some time introducing my dear colleague. Professor Mark Leuchter is a professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism and director of Jewish Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. His publications include the very recent An Empire Far and Wide, the Achaemenid Dynastic Myth and Jewish Scribes in the Late Persian Period, published with Oxford University Press. Other books include The Levites and the Boundaries of Israelite Identity, also with Oxford University Press, published in 2017. He is one of the editors of the New Oxford Bible Commentary, an executive board member of the Canadian Society for Biblical Studies, and contributes regular op-eds to Religion Dispatches, smirkanish.com, and other public-facing venues. He and I were also co-fellows at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, where we grew to talked a lot about the importance of the Achaemenid context for the Hebrew Bible. His favorite band is Rush. And on that note, we will turn to the topic of his lecture today, again titled Persian Imperial Mythology and the Origins of Jewish Demonology.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad you got the most important part in there at the end. It's really. I mentioned Rush once in class. I'm Canadian, so I have to. And I had undergraduate students who had never heard them before, but who thought I was talking about Rush Limbaugh. And I my brain just had to. I felt something break, and I had to take 10 minutes and set them straight. It might have been the most important 10 minutes in my pedagogical career. So I'm glad that I probably don't have to do that here, but if you're not familiar with Rush, go listen to Rush. Good band. And proud sons of Canada. So I'm very, very, very pleased to be here. It's really been an amazing and really, really lovely trip out to Los Angeles so far. I was telling Kate and some other folks before we started here that I feel very much at home in LA. My first time in LA was actually, I think it might have been around 2007. And Bob Cargill was here, and he was working on digital Qumran. It must have been around 2007 or so, right? And so I came here. I was at UCLA's campus before I ever was at Temple's campus. So there's a real strong connection I feel here, and I have really, really wonderful colleagues and friends here, and it's been such a delight to meet their colleagues and friends also. and to see the intellectual community here, which is so robust, and at the same time, like, just kind of cool as well. I mean, because I think, as we all know, in the academic world, intense intellectual exchange can sometimes be accompanied by a lot of stress, and it doesn't have to be. And I want to make that a point because I would like for what we do here today to be much more conversational in nature. I mostly teach undergraduates at this point. I don't teach graduate seminars very often, just because I teach the kinds of courses that generally draw like large undergraduate crowds, and our department really needs that right now. But I always liked teaching graduate seminars where it was more of an open conversation where everybody was bringing a fresh perspective to a topic that they might not have thought about before. And what invariably happens from something like that is that the people who have thought about it a lot before learn something dramatically new and very powerful from these fresh perspectives. It's actually part of the reason why I like teaching undergraduate courses, because, you know, an 18 or 19-year-old student who's never thought about anything relating to anything that you're talking about will see something brand new that you in 20 or 30 years of studying this stuff have just sort of like conditioned yourself not to think about anymore. And I think that in a more pointed way that happens in graduate seminars too. And so I really would like for that to be the sort of ethos that permeates what we do. I also want to share just a little bit of a joke, if I can. So, as I mentioned, I was on UCLA's campus before I ever stepped on Temple's campus. Later in 2007, I was interviewed at Temple University for the job I currently have. And, I was in Sydney, Australia, at University of Sydney at the time, and I, hopped on a plane and I flew halfway around the world, and I was exhausted. And, if you do a job interview, you're on for like the whole day. And somebody dared to ask this poor jet-lagged guy, so why should we hire you? I mean, that was really, I felt like I was being put on the spot. So I said, arguably the funniest thing I will ever say in my life. I said, my mother comes from a family of Cohens. My father comes from a family of Levites. I have to work at a temple. And they laughed, and I got the job. And I haven't been funny since. I mean, I'm only funny when I recite that joke again. So it's been a very interesting foray into what I do and what I did with this last book, and where I want to go now in terms of related research, because I've been working in a comparative religion, although we don't like using that phraseology so much anymore, because I work in a religious studies department. There's a lot more interdisciplinary conversation that goes on. The kind of training that I got as a graduate student was not interdisciplinary at all. And I think one of the things that is much better about graduate programs now is that, 25 or 30 years ago, when I was just starting my graduate program, there wasn't as, I think, open-minded an attitude about ways that we can approach classical texts, archaeology, anthropological questions, and now there really is. I think there are people who are recognizing the value of literary theory, sociological theory, cognitive science, which has been huge for me, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. These give us some really useful tools for approaching old texts and moving beyond the old axioms that I think have been a little bit limiting for us. I mean, I'm not trashing that. I think that the way that we've been doing biblical studies, say, for 30 or 40 years, we've gotten a lot of good material out of that, and we still can. But I think that we can revisit this material with fresh perspective by embracing an interdisciplinary approach sometimes. Maybe not all the time, but sometimes. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of a background in terms of how studying cognitive science made a very big difference for me in terms of approaching the Persian period literature, and what brought me to the conclusions that we're going to be talking about today in our conversation. Cognitive science is revolutionary, and I think everybody who's dealing with ancient texts would benefit tremendously from just doing a little bit of work into what cognitive scientists are doing. Not just cognitive linguists, but cognitive ethnography, cognitive anthropology, cognitive psychology. These are all incredibly useful ways of asking questions about how brains think or how minds function. And not just individual minds, but collective minds on a cultural level. One of the things that came out of the study of cognition was this idea that we can only make sense of the world through our bodies and through the frameworks that we create on a neurological level in terms of how our brains interpret what our bodies sense. And that works culturally too. The things that happen in our bodies, like if I want to understand what a microphone is, I have to hold on to it and speak into it and hear the reverberations. I mean, they're bodily sensations in a way. What is the equivalent of a body on a cultural level? It would be its social institutions, the things that people participate in to form and define meaning. So I think that when we understand cognition working on a cultural level, it gives us some insight into how and why individuals working on the individual level within a culture might produce text the way that they did, might think about things the way that they do, might respond to things the way that they respond to them, and what record that leaves in terms of memory, language, institutions, ritual, and obviously literature. This gave me some really fresh ways of thinking about the Persian period material. And listen, there's stuff in the book, and there's stuff that I know is idiosyncratic, and I think that's okay. I'm not going to convince everybody that my reading on the dating of the Ezra material is correct. And it doesn't even need to be correct. What's more important is what are the implications from the mythological perspective, from the rhetorical perspective, from the ideological and mnemonic perspective. What are the implications of what this literature does when it affects our minds, when we hear it spoken, when we see it with our eyes, when it's part of a ritual incantation or a ritual recital? These are things that we perceive on a cognitive level and we make sense of on a cognitive level. And that creates frameworks that we use to access other things in the world too, to access memory, to access terms of identity formation, to access physical sensations and ambulatory experiences and to situate them socially. So the cognitive sciences, I think, are really, really useful for approaching this older material and seeing something new in it that gives us new ways of thinking about how ancient people might have reacted to the things that moved them to write what they wrote. So, first of all, I just want to make sure that was not unclear. Was I okay with that? Okay, good. Thank you. Does anybody want me to clarify anything with that? Because I know I'm kind of speaking quickly, which I learned is a trauma response, by the way. Anyway, yes, please go ahead.
I guess I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate on something. I mean, you were probably going to do this, but methods of cognitive science that. Yeah.
Sure. One thing that I think is important is this idea, and this was very significant, that cognition is embodied. And this is what I mentioned about using your body to sense things. Every linguistic metaphor that we have for the world that we live in, I mean, all language is metaphorical and symbolic anyway, but the language, the grammatical systems that we put together to make sense of the world and to define the world are filtered through our bodily experiences and can only be understood through our bodily experiences. So George Lakoff, who is a cognitive scientist emeritus at Berkeley, did a lot of work over the last 50 years on this. He was really revolutionary and incredibly, incredibly accessible as well. He's one of those few scholars that does remarkably important work that people who are not in his field can totally follow. And that's really important. Listen, this is a monograph and it's for colleagues. But I also wanted it to be for people who maybe work in anthropology of religion or maybe work in classics, and I wanted them to get something out of it too. But if I was pitching it to a bit of a different audience, I would also write it a little differently so that undergraduate students could read it, so that my brother could read it on a flight to Dubai or whatever. People who are not researchers can benefit from the research that we do if we pitch it correctly, and Lakoff does that. So I definitely encourage you to check him out. He's got a lot of stuff on YouTube, actually, that's really interesting to listen to, and he's also got this really nice voice to listen to as well. So Lakoff came up with this idea of embodied cognition, or advanced the idea of embodied cognition, and he makes the point that the language that we use to make sense of the things that we perceive really reflects spatiality and orientation in space. So, he uses very often when he gives a public lecture this idea that when we talk about relationships, we talk about a relationship moving forward, or we reached a dead end, or we're not progressing. So we're thinking about traveling, and we're thinking about the relationship as a vehicle, and we're thinking about people in the relationship as passengers. And, those are frameworks that we then use to qualify and make sense of the interactions that we have with people in a relationship. So that's the kind of method that he uses, right? It's almost kind of nuts and bolts in a way. but surprisingly effective and useful. So when I was writing this book, I wanted to apply some of this to the way people think about Persian period Judaism. And I really want to make clear, and we talked about this at lunch a little bit, I think we can use the phrase Judaism in the Persian period. It just might not mean what Judaism means in the rabbinic period. But I think we can say that there are Jews in the Persian period who identify themselves on an ethnological level with a particular set of traditions and customs that vary, of course, from one community to the next. But I think it's fair to use the phrase Persian period Judaism. There are some scholars who would disagree with me, but I make an argument in the book for why I think it's okay. So I'm going to go with that here. If anybody would like to suggest a different way to nuance it, that's fine. I mean, I'm open to suggestions. But when I was thinking about this material, and I was thinking about the way that Persian period Judaism must have reacted to Persian imperialism, there's been a lot of work done in the last 30 or 40 years on imperialism and post-colonialism. And I think post-colonial theory is really useful. There's also now anti-colonial theory, which is also useful. It's pitched a little bit differently. But I think that what makes it really useful is when you pair it with cognitive science. Because one of the things that post-colonial theorists will say when they're looking at material coming out of the Persian period or any imperial period is that when you're living under an empire, you can't escape the empire when it comes to your identity formation. You're no longer what you once were, but you're also not the people who are dominating you. You're in this sort of in-between space. And therefore, you're constantly having to redefine your identity by the terms of the empire that are holding the keys to your past. So that is what post-colonial theorists have been arguing for a long time, and I think that they're right. But why I think they're right is because it dovetails absolutely perfectly with cognitive science. Because cognitive science will say that you experience reality through your body, and on a cultural level, you experience reality through ritual or economy or language, things that are socially constructed. And that is exactly what happens during the Persian period. The post-colonial ideas about adoption of new senses of identity and perennially unstable senses of identity are emerging in the Persian period on the cognitive level, on a cultural level. So I think that when we take post-colonial theory and cognitive theory, or cognitive science, and we bring them together, we have a really valuable toolkit for going back to a text like Ezra Nehemiah and saying, why does it look the way it looks? Why are these phrases paired with each other? Why in Nehemiah 8, for example, does it say Ezra the priest and Ezra the scribe? There are some scholars who would say, well, those are two redactional strata. But what if it's not? What if the phrase priest and scribe is, part of a framework that was sort of a binary pair during the Persian period? And it was. So, I have colleagues who would say, the part of Nehemiah 8 that refers to Ezra as a priest is old. The part of Nehemiah 8 that refers to Ezra as a scribe is later, and it's a redactional accretion. But that ignores the cognitive fact that from 484 BCE onward, after the failed Babylonian revolt, there were massive upsets in what it meant to be a priest and what it meant to be a scribe. And I think that's what's being reflected in this material, and that's why Ezra is called both, and that's why he functions as both. It's a challenge to a particular kind of earlier status quo. And it's a challenge that could only really obtain under the auspices of Persian imperialism. So this is a very long-winded sort of preface for getting into the real meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today. And that is the origins of Jewish demonology. And I know that, was it last year that Annette was here?
3 or 4 years ago now, I think. I think 3 years ago.
Okay.
Yes.
So I know that we have a colleague, Annette Reed, who's at Harvard right now. She wrote a really, really good book on angelology, demonology, and the origins of Jewish writing. And she makes the case that in the early Hellenistic period, so seemingly out of nowhere, priestly scribes are engaging in a really dramatic sort of theorization of the relationships between angels and demons and writing and power and numinous activity or mantic activity. And I think she's right, but what always kind of bothered me about that, it doesn't, I'm not upset. I don't want to, I'm not these are very low stakes. I mean, we got bigger fish to fry in this country right now than the dating of, certain ideas to the Persian period or the Hellenistic period. I'm not going to get political. But what kind of bothered me about that is that she's right, but where does that come from? Why all of a sudden do we have the sort of Cambrian explosion? Where does that come from? I mean, paleontologists will say that the Cambrian explosion wasn't, in fact, an explosion. There was a buildup to the Cambrian explosion, and that's why all of a sudden, as my grandmother would say, in mittenderinnen, in the middle of everything, we have this explosion of life, in the prehistoric world. But that didn't come from nowhere. There were precursors to that. And so what I would like us to do is explore the precursors to Jewish demonology that scholars like Annette Reed are exploring. Which means that I don't actually want to talk about demons all that much. I want to talk about the generating circumstances that led people to form theories about demons and theories about the powers that demons had. And I think for that we need to go earlier than the Hellenistic period. I think for that we need to go into the Persian period, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. So let me summarize briefly what I think about the Persian period and what I think about this thing called Persian Imperial Mythology or Achaemenid Imperial Mythology. First of all, I think we need to be aware that myth is everywhere. We have myths today. As I tell my students, if I were to say to you, make America great, that's a suggestion. If I were to say to you, make America great again, that's a myth. That's a political myth. God doesn't even necessarily have to factor into that, although the concept of the divine is used in that. Myths don't need to be about the gods. Myths are transcendent ideas that have non-transcendent, very specific, discrete applications. And as a colleague of mine at Rutgers, Deborah Scoggins-Valentine, wrote, what myths really do is they connect nature and culture. They suggest that the things that we come up with are part of some kind of cosmic pattern that predates us and therefore ties what we do to patterns of the cosmos, thereby legitimizing them. So what I want to suggest is that when the Persian period began, as many of you probably know, it began a little tumultuously. The first emperor of Persia is Cyrus the Great, and he was apparently, at least Cyrus the Pretty Good. I mean, he was pretty well regarded all around and pretty successful in establishing the Persian Empire. But very shortly after Cyrus died, there seems to be increasing tension and a lack of confidence with respect to his successor, Cambyses. And then there's questions about Cambyses' death, the nature of who succeeded Cambyses. Was it his brother Bardia? Was it some pretender named Smerdis? We don't know for sure. There's all kinds of questions about it. There's kind of like, I'm going to get vulgar for just a second, but the document that gives us the most information about this is the Behistun inscription, which we know and love. When we were in Ann Arbor, we formed a little group called the Behistun Bench Press Club. We did. Mm-hmm. I don't think we did all that bench pressing, though.
No, we mostly just looked at the Behistun.
Yeah. And dreamt of what could be.
Yes.
So the Behistun inscription gives us a tremendous amount of information about this tumultuous period. But what it's really doing is something that Steve Bannon has more recently called flooding the zone with shit. And what Steve Bannon meant by that is if you flood the media with conflicting information and a torrent of it that is nonstop, nobody will know what to believe. And if people don't know what to believe, if they can't trust facts, then what they will do is they will default on a cognitive level to myths. Because there is nothing more pervasive in human experience than mythology in terms of social organization. So that's kind of what the Behistun inscription is actually doing, is presenting us with all kinds of conflicting information and an abundance of it, and not just once, but 3 times. It does it in 3 different languages, and each version of the Behistun inscription that's carved into the cliff is just a little different than the others. So, 2 of them are more similar than the third, but it automatically brings up the question of what do you believe and how do you believe it? And so what emerges from the Behistun inscription is that a king named Darius comes to power, and Darius is a descendant of a man named Achaemenid, and he is therefore the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. And he establishes a myth of this dynasty, and the myth is the Behistun inscription. And it is that until he came to power, a demon called Drauga was in charge. And Drauga was the lie. That's what the word Drauga means. Druj means lie, I think, in Old Persian. And Drauga had these people, agents in the world, who were serving him called Dregvants. And these Dregvants were spreading the lie throughout the empire that Cyrus had founded. And really what it is it's a kind of an iteration of this old chaos mythology that we find throughout the ancient world, that the gods that you worship are the gods of order, but nipping at their heels are the gods of chaos, the chaos monsters. And in a sense, Draugr is sort of pitched as a chaos monster with political intent. And it's only with Darius' rise to power and his defeat of his enemies that Draugr is expelled from the empire, and that the empire under him, the Achaemenid Empire, becomes the fulfillment of all empires. It becomes the ultimate empire. It becomes the fulfillment of all national destinies. It bridges mythic time and political time. It makes every waterway the mythical sea that has now been tamed by the empire. And this idea that the waters are mythical and dangerous is a very, very old mythological motif. So the Achaemenid myth is very much about the end of time, but the fulfillment of the end of time. Like, we don't need to worry about stuff anymore. It's all been fulfilled in the reign of Darius and those who followed after him. There's all kinds of iconography, of course, that follows after this. What's really interesting about the Behistun, I should have brought a picture, I'm sorry about that, but what's very interesting about the Behistun inscription is that you can't actually read the inscription, or at least until the modern time, you can't actually read it. It was carved onto a cliff underneath a relief where you saw imagery. And from a mile away, you could see the imagery, but you couldn't see the actual writing. It was what one scholar calls visible but not legible. And Darius, after he had the inscription written out on the cliff, took measures to make sure that nobody could actually approach it close enough to read it. So how do you know what's in the inscription? Through copies. So the only way to access the myth is to have scribes mediate it for you. So suddenly the scribal craft becomes more than just take this note down or write this letter or write out this receipt. The scribal craft becomes a kind of a cosmic vehicle and a way to rehearse the myth again and again and again. So scribes and the production of literature and the organization of native literature to align with Persian standards, that in a way becomes the rehearsal of the myth. And this lasted for 200 years. The real question I think that we have to ask is, did this myth, or was this myth, like, universally accepted? Or was everybody sort of like, yeah, the myth, but we know what really went on? In other words, was everybody aware that the Behistun mythology was largely just propaganda? And they just went along with it for ceremonial purposes because the Persians were in charge? Or did they actually really believe it? And I think a lot of them actually really believed it. That's what happens under an empire. There are people who capitulate. There are people who resist. There are people who capitulate and resist at the same time. There are people who negotiate. There are people who accommodate. You can't escape the empire. It's ever present. I'm going to go back to something else that Lakoff does when he addresses large crowds. This is the cognitive scientist from Berkeley I mentioned before. We're going to do a little experiment right now, okay? Are you ready? Don't think of an elephant. It's possible, right? Because I've activated the frame of what an elephant is, and you can't not think about it once I introduce it. Once you're living under an empire, you can't not think about the empire. And everything you do to try to avoid the empire is still a reaction to the empire. So what happens with the Behistun inscription is that you can't escape it. And it becomes part of your culture, even on a local level in Jerusalem or Elephantine or Babylon or wherever you might be. So for 200 years, this is what perseveres under all the successors of Darius. And then suddenly, and I mean very suddenly, the Persian Empire dissolves into dust. It's going real strong until about 340 BCE. And within 10 years, gone. In part because of Alexander the Great, who, oddly enough, considered himself the final Achaemenid. So, I mean, kinship and lineage is sort of symbolic in Alexander's, self-understanding. But it's not just Alexander and the threat of Greece that brought down the Persian Empire. What brought down the Persian Empire was internal strife, the fact that there was corruption, the fact that the Achaemenid dynasty engaged in violence against themselves. There was fratricide and patricide and duplicity and punishment. And I mean, it was not, a kumbaya kind of environment. And what's kind of interesting to me and what drew me to this after many years working exclusively in Iron Age Israel is that I was brought up in the academic world to think, like, Under the Persians, everything was fine. Everything was happy under Persia. Persia was like the happy time. And Persian inscriptions use that language. Like, they want people to live happy lives, and the people were happy, and they joyously did what I told them to do. I mean, that's what all these Persian kings keep on saying. But no, it wasn't. It wasn't happy. I mean, there was a lot of dirty pool being played. So what ultimately happens when the Persian Empire falls is that the framework, the mythological framework for the empire, crumbles into dust as well. And I think the literature that we start to see emerging right at that time starts seeing the entire Persian experiment as a lie. And lies are demonic, which means empires are demonic, because empires are just lies in political form. And so what I want to suggest is that the origins of Jewish demonology that we see in the early Hellenistic period all the way forward through the rabbinic period, even today, I'm really not kidding. There are people today in the Jewish world, as many of you know, who actually believe that there are demons out there that are trying to steal the lives of their babies for the first week of their life or something like that. Listen, the idea and the belief in demons is something that is ubiquitous in the human condition. In the 2016 election, something like 60% of registered Republicans believed that Hillary Clinton was either possessed by a demon or was a demon. I'm not making this up. Like, this was actually published in a study by somebody who was looking at the way religion functioned on the political level, in Trump's rise to power. So demonology is not something we can escape. We always sort of default to that. A demon is responsible, or, where are my car keys? Oh, a gnome stole my car keys. Gnomes are basically cute little demons with hats and big noses, right? I mean, that's kind of what a gnome is. I mean, demons are things that we make up to make sense of things that are troublesome to us. But Jewish demonology is much more cosmic in orientation. And instead of focusing on, I think, what Annette Reed and other scholars rightly focus on, what I was really interested in doing with this book is building up to what led to the sudden explosion of demonology. And what I would suggest is that the explosion of demonology that we find in early Hellenistic Judaism, and that persists for the next several centuries, is derived from the memory of the failure of an empire. Not just the failure of an empire, but the crushing failure of an empire. Because for 200 years, Judaism was contingent upon this empire. Judaism was contingent upon this idea that God worked through this empire, that God's truth was revealed through this empire, that the temple was rebuilt through this empire, that the first emperor was the new Mashiach. Cyrus the Great is called a Messiah in the book of Isaiah. This is some heavy stuff. And when you have built your identity, your ethnic identity, your religious identity, around this concept, then when the concept turns out to be a lie, that's terrifying. And nothing scares you more than demons. So the framework of fear, demon, chaos, empire, all of this is now part of the cognition as Jews move forward through the Hellenistic period, under the Hasmoneans, under the Romans, under the Sasanians, under the Ottomans, you name it. So I think that the origins of Jewish demonology can be traced to the failure of the Persian project, the failure of Achaemenid mythology. And it will be interesting for us to explore how and why that works and what some of the ramifications are for going back to Jewish texts that are produced at this time or after this time, and how they might carry the memory of this failure, or how they might respond to the memory of this failure. So I think I'll stop there, and what I'd like to do is open the floor for conversation. Kate, do you?
So do you mind if I just kind of start, just to provide maybe some helpful context, not only for our grads, but also in just the general theoretical models you're working with and the data behind it. So this connection of cognitive science and post-colonial theory, I actually think is really located in the theories of the study of religion in a lot of ways. I'm thinking of Susan Clancy, and it sounds dismissive, and I don't mean to make it this. But Susan Clancy, in I think 2008, wrote a book about entitled "Abducted: How People Come to Believe They Were Kidnapped by Aliens." Essentially, what is the belief system? How does the social how do the social aspects or the actual spatial realities of the world contribute to their broader understandings of whether or not they're abducted by aliens. So this is something that people in religious studies have already started doing, but I haven't seen it until Professor Leuchter's work be so specifically applied to the Hebrew Bible and specifically the Persian period. I also think that the you're talking about myths as making something. This is again like reflective of like Russell McCutcheon's theory of mythifications. Myths are more verbs than they are nouns. They make certain things true in their repetition and dissemination. So this is something that, with the Persian Imperial mythology, you're seeing Darius and the Persian Empire disseminating these myths and editing them even as they disseminate them in Aramaic or on other papyri. So I, of course, will open it up for questions, but I think you bring up really excellent points in terms of how we think about the actual people behind our Jewish texts and traditions and the continuity of this from earlier periods. Is it just a matter of, there's Mesopotamian demons, let's copy it down, or is it the basis of human experience trying to explain what is happening in the world? Some things being more traumatic than others, maybe. So I think these are really important questions, not just for ancient Judaism, but just for how do humans deal with the realities of things changing traumatically or not. So I have more specific questions, but I think opening it up for broader discussions is really important.
We're going to start out, if I even go before what we call in Judaism, to go to pre-exilic Israelite type religion, what I find is consistent about Judaism across history is that essentially the core belief is probably that there's a God. I'm not even talking about how many there are, but there is this God. You have to adhere to some form of belief or law code that he has, and that what happens to you as a result, either in this world or in the next world, is a result of how you act and what you believe. Okay? Mm-hmm. But if you look throughout history, basically Jews operate as a minority almost throughout this entire period, and they consistently absorb or deal with local issues. And there's like an endless number of examples. Like Rashi, his analysis mirrors Catholic analysis at the time. Maimonides was dealing with, scholasticism and Aristotle. Why do you need such a complex reason for Jews to absorb this demonology as a response? Maybe they're just doing exactly what the Persians are doing at that time, and they're like, we believe that too. And I think you ask somebody Orthodox Jewish today what they believe about life after death or whatever that is, mm-hmm. They're going to sound like a Christian because they just don't know. Mm-hmm. And we're in this American environment, and that's what we believe. And so why the need for complexity?
Well, I don't disagree with you. I think it is very simple that for 200 years, Jews living under Persia adopted a lot of Persian convention. But what I'm interested in is less like of the Jewish response and more of just like the human response. So if you're living under an imperial regime and the language changes, and as Kate and I have talked about before, even the font that you use to write your own language changes, that affects, and cognitive science demonstrates this, that actually affects perception. It affects memory. You start remembering things differently. So, I do think you're right. What I want to talk about, though, and where I go with this in the book, is that when we look at a particular text that I think was written at the very, very end of the Persian period, it's an ancient Jewish text in the book of Enoch that a lot of people think comes from the early Greek period, but I think it's talking about the death of the Persian Empire. All the things that I'm talking about in terms of where demonology comes from can be found in that text. It is, but it's not the whole book. It's only chapters 6 to 11. And that text, I think, is very, 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 very late Persian. And I think it's witnessing and mythologizing the death of the empire. And what it's doing is providing the framework that moving forward leads to the idea of demonology. So I think it's basically a reaction to a political crisis. And when we deal with political crises, we come up with some pretty amazing things sometimes just to survive. And they break with tradition even as they're commenting on tradition, and even as they get reincorporated back into that tradition. I'm teaching an undergraduate class right now called History of the Devil, and by far, like the most interesting part of the class from what my undergrads are telling me was the discussion of like these fallen angels that descend from heaven and decide to corrupt humankind and have sex with human women, and they give birth to these giant monsters that start engaging in cannibalism. A lot of that, as I wrote in one of the chapters of the book, is sort of a critical metaphor for the failure of the Persian Empire, the failure of its concept of truth and happiness, the failure of its concept of peace and harmony, and the bloodshed that followed as a result. So I think it is, in fact, rather direct. It's just that some of the authors use a rather fantastic language to describe it, and that sets the terms for how other authors pick up where they left off.
I think your favorite band should be Judas Priest then.
No. No. Iron Maiden. Yeah.
So the Jews are exposed to the Zoroastrian ideology. And I was wondering your intention, how does that work with Ahura and Achaemenid in the Zoroastrian school of thought?
Well, there's some debate about how much the Persians of the time were actually practicing Zoroastrianism versus how much they contributed to the practice of Zoroastrianism. I do think that there are some old Iranian ideas that are definitely factored into this sort of dichotomy between Ahura Mazda on one hand and Draugr the Lie on the other hand. And there's parallels, obviously, with Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. I don't know enough about the development of the Avestan literature to determine whether the ideas about Ahriman predate or postdate the Persian Imperial mythology that I'm talking about. But there's definitely a connection there, and that's part of the reason why Judaism of later times, especially in things like the War Scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in some rabbinic texts as well, has this dichotomy between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. I mean, I do think that there's a strong cultural imprint that is left on Jewish thinking, and in particular Jewish apocalypticism, that comes from the Iranian context. So I think you're right.
And the fact that Zoroastrianism supposedly goes back 5,000 years, so it kind of predates the Judaic, Abrahamic period. So I figured maybe that there is a connection there, at least predates that.
Well, I do think it's pretty old, but that's the trick, isn't it? Like past a certain point in time when we look back, we can say less and less and less and less. So I think, like, for example, I think there was a historical Moses, but I can say virtually nothing about him. But I can say what later generations thought about him. So I think there was probably a Zoroaster. But I don't know what I can say about him. I can only say what later writers or tradents had to think about him that was eventually codified in text. But yeah, I mean, it's a real question how much of the traditional self-concept of a religion draws from real historical memory versus how much of it I think is an attempt to redefine a communal identity during times of crisis or times of power as well. And I'm always open to new evidence suggesting that we can push things back further. But I do think that we should be cautious before we do. But it's definitely very, very ancient, and I do think it predates what we can properly call Judaism. Thank you.
Thanks very much for starting this very interesting discussion. I'll try to frame my comments in a cohesive way and not a rambly way, but I can't promise. So I was very interested in your use of terms like, for example, when it came to Behestun, it's either you have a belief in this or you don't have a belief. Or, I forget, and in responding to the last question, you said either these were successful or not successful. I forget the reference, unfortunately. But, so I guess my question is, are we dealing with kind of, when it comes to, I guess, belief or cognition in this kind of manner, are we dealing with absolute states of kind of yes or no, or are we dealing with kind of more gray areas which then, I guess, occupy a more kind of epistemic sphere that then kind of come together to create larger understandings or systems of power? And I guess I'll kind of give two opposing examples of how I'm kind of trying to understand through this and kind of coming up with opposite results in both cases. On the one hand, as you say, you have the text debates, they all say something slightly different, kind of. And I see this almost as like flooding the kind of the Steve Bannon quote that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Flooding the information space with bullshit in order, perhaps by the great king, to reorder the world. So you do that to break current epistemic understandings, not totally destroy, break them, and then replace them with new ones.
Mm-hmm.
So that's on the one hand. But then on the other hand, I'm thinking of the imprint of the imperial presence from somewhere like Egypt, where Egyptologists have a really hard time identifying what's Persian, what's 26th dynasty, and what's 28th through 30th dynasty. Even the things that used to be called the Persian dress, we've now realized that these go back to maybe 100 years before Achaemenid presence in Egypt or Achaemenid conquest.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, you kind of do have this system that's very interested in kind of projecting an image of power, but one that is, again, ambiguous when you start to get into the nitty-gritty. But on the other hand, at least from the area of the world that I'm most familiar with, you have almost like a zero. It's very hard to detect a trace of that presence at the same time. So I'm wondering your thoughts on all that.
It's a damn good question. Just a long answer, yes with an if. Short answer, no with a but. That's just from The Simpsons. You know that one. Okay. Look, it's a great question, and I can give a short answer, but it's a preface to a bigger issue. And the short answer, I think, is this: I think the royal literature is dealing with binaries, and it's dealing with a very particular kind of framework where you have stark oppositions. You have a dichotomy between good and evil, right and wrong, yes and no, yin and yang, if you will. And what that's doing is it's establishing the cognitive framework. But cognition is about more than just consciousness, right? At any one time, we're using our conscious thought only constitutes maybe 1% of our brain activity, which means that there are a bazillion other thoughts going through our head that we don't even know that's affecting the thought going through our head that we do know and that we are aware of. And so what the binary literature is doing is coming up with a very simple framework with a yes, no, right, wrong, up, down binary. But that's affecting the much more complicated network, the sort of fuzzier things that you're talking about. And then it becomes a much more ornate cultural sort of process or program or enterprise to look at all the diversity of these fuzzy things and to align them with the framework. And cognitive scientists note that we do this all the time, just by the way of how we use language to introduce certain things. So, recently I was listening to a cognitive psychologist whose name is Lira Boroditsky, who I think is at UCSD. And she made a really interesting point. She was saying that if you refer to something as a virus versus refer to something as a beast, so like the virus of poverty, right, or the virus of misinformation, or whatever it might be, as opposed to the monster of misinformation, it affects the way you think about what it actually means and what you can actually do about it. Because the framework for virus involves symptoms, involves the idea of a cure, involves the idea of diagnosis, whereas a beast is something that you run away from and it could probably tear you limb from limb. So, that's a modern thing, but those same kind of processes worked when you're talking about antiquity, and somebody's looking at, a scribal copy of the Behistun inscription, and they're reading it, or they're studying it, or they're teaching it, and then they go to the rituals in the Jerusalem temple, and they start looking at these rituals on a conscious level, but on the subconscious, on the multi-conscious level, the Behistun framework is guiding them through the ritual, and it winds up affecting what the ritual means. It winds up affecting how the text is read. It winds up affecting how the buildings are perceived. So I do think the stark framework and the fuzzy framework are sort of in dialogue with each other constantly. And that's one of the things that post-colonial theorists would say is what's so destabilizing about an empire. You're constantly renegotiating what you think you know because you can't be what you once were and what your ancestors once were, but you're also not separate from them. It's like the dress thing that you're talking about. Like it's factored into a new framework, but it also draws from an older tradition. But it's not the older tradition anymore because it's part of the new framework. So, we're kind of always perennially neither here nor there under Persia. And there's this remarkable sense of anxiety that this creates. One of the things I talk about in the first chapter of the book, maybe it's the introduction, I think it's the first chapter, I can't remember, is that there's anxiety about the Persian period in scholarship and how to qualify it. But that anxiety about the Persian period is also evident in ancient Jewish literature. There is uncertainty about how to qualify what the Persian period is in early rabbinic literature. It's not exactly Second Temple. It's not Second Temple because the Second Temple was born during the Persian period, but the Persian period channels this older sort of Neo-Assyrian ethos, and that's well before the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it's sort of like inherently destabilizing. And that creates a tremendous amount of anxiety for the rabbis. I have to imagine it also created a tremendous anxiety for the people who were trying to navigate it when it was on the ground. So I hope that that's a helpful way of addressing the issue. But I think you're right. Like to just say, it's the binary framework, I think that negates everything that we know about how our brains actually work with binary frameworks. Thank you.
Can you describe a few examples of demons and how they explain particular fears?
Sure. The example that I think I'd like to give is from this early work of apocalyptic literature that I think was written at the end of the Persian period. It's a story of angels that descend from heaven. Are you familiar with the book of Genesis? In the book of Genesis, there's this 4-verse like little fragment, and it says that the sons of God looked at the daughters of men and found them fair. They descended and they had sex with them, and this led to all kinds of cosmic corruption. So this ancient work of Jewish literature that I'm talking about knows that story and expands that story and says that these angels descended from heaven and their goal was to corrupt humankind. And in corrupting humankind, they said, we'll do it through cavorting with human women and teaching them secret knowledge. And in teaching them secret knowledge, they disrupt all kinds of cosmic boundaries. And as a result of this, demons are produced. So demons are the result of cosmic categories being shattered. What's very interesting, and I didn't really think about this until just a couple days ago when I was preparing some comments for this. What's very interesting is that in Kabbalistic thought of the medieval period, the idea that the universe is structured according to concentrations of energy, if any of the containers of those energies are overflown, in other words, if the energy gets too great for the container, that's where demons erupt from. So this later medieval understanding of demons and demonology that comes from Kabbalah, I think carries forward some memory of the same idea that through the power that one finds in an empire, but a broken empire is where you see the eruption of demons and demonology. So I think that it's really like the recognition that emperors have power, but emperors can be monsters. But God put emperors in charge, but emperors are still monsters. Like that raises all kinds, again, anxiety questions. And when we're anxious about things, that's when we think the monsters are going to come against us. So that would be my answer. If you actually really want to know about later traditions of Jewish demonology, like the actual names of demons and how the rabbis think about them, there's a wonderful book written by Sarah Rodas, I think called The Devils in the Details.
Yes,
is that it? Mm-hmm. And she's a Talmudic scholar, and this book is fabulous, and it's written for people who aren't doing research but who are interested in these deeper questions. And it's a really good example of what happens within the next couple hundred years after the Persian period, and how a very, very ornate network of demonology develops, mostly as a way of people trying to control demons. Like, if you can put demons into a list, if you can categorize them, if you can give them definitions, then you're exerting control over them through this written enterprise. And that ultimately leads to all kinds of texts that later sages studied and developed into even more ornate stories of demons. So that's a great book to read, and I really highly recommend it. It's also not my field of expertise, so I can't say too much more about it.
It's also a broader phenomenon in late antiquity. It's often called by Heidi Marks the demonization of late antiquity, where there's a growing increase in the prevalence of demons who are actual evil entities versus daimones, which are not necessarily evil or good. Some are bad, some are good. The demon, for example, that's depicted in The Exorcist, is a pretty good Mesopotamian demon that is on your side. Pazuzu is a good demon that protects you from Lamashtu. The Exorcist got that wrong. But in late antiquity in particular, demons become bad and only bad. But prior to that, they're morally neutral. They could go either way, if that makes sense.
Can I piggyback on that for a second? So we have a colleague who lives in Philadelphia with me. Her name is Esther Hamori. And Esther wrote a book that's geared for public audience called God's Monsters. And she notes something really interesting. She notes that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures, God has both angels and demons that he uses, right? In the New Testament, demons are on the other side. God does not have demons that are at his beck and call. Demons are the enemies of God. So between the formation of Jewish scripture and the formation of New Testament literature, which was largely Jewish, there's been a massive paradigm shift in terms of like the relationship between God and demons. So there's much more work to be done in that. And I think that the relationship between Jews to the empire that they're living under probably has to factor into that some way, because the relationship between Jews and Rome was fraught with all kinds of difficulty and varied from one emperor to the next.
It's why you get the demon named Legion in the Gospel of Mark.
Yep.
The actual word for a Roman military unit. But we have our own specialist of demons here at UCLA, but Mesopotamian demons, who teaches a class on it if anyone is interested. Gina Konstantopoulos as well. Yep. Speak of the devil. Speak of the demon. Yes. Sorry, I was sitting right there. I had to do it. Yes.
Incognito. This actually, so you mentioned Pazuzu. So the interesting thing, right, we get in Mesopotamia is, demons are really hard to define using the term, and this Yoshiko Reed talks about in her book, like why she doesn't want to use the word supernatural, just use it because it doesn't make any sense. Everything's part of what we would think of as the natural world under their definition. Can't imply something being more than that when it's integrated into how the world works. But in Mesopotamia, Pazuzu, it's not like he wants to protect you, he'd just rather fight the monster. So there's always this idea of a chaotic force that can be directed in some regards, and when it can't, it turns on you. But when you're looking at that shift you mentioned, I promise I'll get to a question about this. Would you say that this imposition of creating this categorical distinction implies that you have an imposition and setting up an enemy, where God versus demons in the New Testament, because now we have a diametric opposition to set up this enemy as a whole. But if we're talking about demons as you are kind of coming out of this empire mindset and living under empire, do you see that they're coming? Is there the same idea of having them do they have to grow out of opposition as well? If we're not getting that oppositional framework, nor do we have it in Mesopotamia, of course. It's only when we really have here's team A and here's team B. But so how does that maybe negotiate the value or the existence under empire? Demons are growing out of this, and they seem a response to really trying to critique some of the ways empire is being imposed upon you. But it's not a critique that, as I've understood your discussion, is really resulting in and now it's an oppositional battle, and they are unilaterally the enemy.
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because one of the things I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk about is this really fascinating concept that I think starts already in Second Temple Judaism, but it's really developed in the rabbinic literature, of this thing called the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that all human beings have within them. And there's different concepts of the Yetzer Hara. It's either some kind of incubus, like some kind of like an actual like demon that is like, holding onto your lungs or something like that. Or it's just a sort of metaphysical inclination that is woven into the fabric of the human cosmos, or microcosmos. I don't think that this idea just comes out of nowhere. It has to come out of some of the questions or some of the difficulties that you raised in your question. I think it's important to note that it's the failure, in my view, at least, and who knows, maybe a month from now I'll wake up and I'll be like, no, I was wrong about all that, because it wouldn't be the first time I've said that about my own work. But as far as I can tell right now, the eruption of an idea of a demonic substratum to the world in which we live comes at a time with the failure of the empire. But the empire wasn't just about the Persians. It's not like Jews living at the time who are writing, 1 Enoch 6 to 11, which is where I think this stuff is really starting. They're not saying those Persians are responsible for all this and we are, innocent. I think they're looking to themselves and they're looking to the priesthood and they're looking to the tradition of scholarship that they sustained in their scribal ranks for, a long time. And they're holding themselves accountable. And that's different then, because then the demonic is not necessarily about us versus them, or about right versus wrong, or light versus dark. It's a much more complex question, and it becomes much more frightening because it's much more immediate too. I mean, when I was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish environment, and I was taught about the Yetzer Hara real early on. In fact, I'll tell you when I was first told about the Yetzer Hara. My family was always tilted a little bit more progressive, but I went to an Orthodox day school when I was in kindergarten. I was 5. And they gave us a worksheet of things you should or should not be able to do on Shabbat. And we always left the television on in our house on Shabbat, so I circled television. I was, as a 5-year-old, sent to the principal's office as a 5-year-old to be scolded by Rabbi Eliezer Shostak about how the Yetzer Hara, and I remember him using that locution, was responsible for, my, veering from the path of righteousness or whatever the hell he was talking about. I also found it interesting that all the religious kids used to beat the crap out of me on Shabbat at our synagogue because I wasn't religious enough. So, watching TV, bad. But, kicking somebody in the face, go for it, as long as you're back in services for the second part after the rabbi's sermon.
Sounds like Judas Maccabee.
Yeah, I'm not, I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with the whole thing, but as you can tell. But, all of this is to say that the idea of the Yetzer Hara, I think, speaks to the intimateness, or the intimacy, I don't think intimateness is a word, it should be, the intimacy of the demonic potential. And that anybody can make a bad decision and in that moment be a demon or be a vehicle for demonic power. Even a good person can make a bad decision and do something truly horrible. So I think that this is not something that is brand new. It's not something that just comes along with, modern neuroscience and psychology and understanding of how, depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder works that make people do awful things. This is a part of the human condition. And, thousands of years ago, people would assign to that kind of behavior some kind of demonic possession, which means that it's not just the empire that is the source of the demonic. It's the failure of an empire that unleashes the source of demonism in all of us because we're living in an imperial circumstance. I mean, all of Jewish literature, classic Jewish literature, as you know, from the Assyrian period down through the Ottoman period, is written under the auspices of empire. Even modern Jewish literature, until, even today to a certain degree, we can still say is influenced by imperial ideology. Or the echoes of imperial ideology. We can't get away from it. So the frameworks that I think were in place under Persia that shattered and created a new framework of shattered reality, I think that persists for a very, very long time, and it affected things that were both near and far, distant and intimate. So that I think it's a really important point that you bring up because it has implications for the way we think about a wider swath of literature.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm going to ask this question in part because I have an article on it, but you can, of course, disagree with me. How do you distinguish between the late Persian period and early Hellenistic period? Is that a change that's actually felt by Jewish communities? And is it more the memory of Persia, or is it the actual, the memory of a Mashiach in Cyrus, or a memory of Persia that you see in the apocalyptic texts? Or is it the actual Alexander doing his stuff?
I think there's 100 ways to answer that.
Yeah. Sorry.
On the administrative level, it's pretty clear that there's a fair degree of continuity. And, Aramaic remains, a language of scholarship, and eventually, Greek comes in, but it's not like a hard shift right away on the practical level. But, if we are only measuring things practically, if we're only measuring things, by observable behavior, by phenotype, then we're ignoring the significance of genotype. And this is where the cognitive part really comes in. And I can speak from my own experience on this, because I've done a lot of work on cognitive thought, largely because I'm working through some traumatic issues of my own. In 2007, I'm going to share something quite personal here, and you know this, and I think you know this too. In 2007, I was engaged to somebody who turned out to be very mentally ill, and she took her own life. And it was right before I went to Australia. It was a massive disruption in my life. It was incredibly traumatic. I didn't get the therapy that I needed to work through it, and it caused a lot of problems for me over the next couple of years, and that I still feel in my body. It has a neurological effect. But if you had met me 2 weeks later, when I wasn't talking about it with anybody, you would never know that there was a problem. You would never know that my nervous system was starting to corrode itself. You would never know that I was grinding my teeth so hard at night that I literally crushed them while I was asleep. I don't have a molar here, and I don't have a molar here, because the trauma and the PTSD forced my body to do things that I could not control. You would never know those things. You would say, Mark is still going to his job. He is still packing up his apartment so he can move to Australia. He is still revising his second book. I actually continued editing my second book in the aftermath of her death, and as her father was making death threats against my family because he was also deeply unstable. It was an incredibly traumatic time. You'd never know it just from the observable stuff. But it was anything but continuous. There was a remarkable disruption, and it surfaced later. I don't want to say it ruined my life, but it very well could have. And I think that what we experience on that level, and I know that it might sound like I'm being like dramatic, that we can map my own personal experience onto like a cultural trauma, but it's not, because human minds are human minds are human minds are human minds. My brain and your brain, my nervous system and your nervous system look exactly the same. The activity in my brain might be different if I experienced trauma and you didn't on a brain scan. But if you experienced trauma, you would see very similar patterns on your brain scan that you would see on mine. So if human brains and human minds all work the same, then human cultures react the same as well. And cultural trauma is a real thing. And cultures do not react to trauma differently than individuals react to trauma. They react to trauma in a very similar way. So I do think that there is a very serious break when the Achaemenid dynasty ends. It just isn't felt immediately. It takes a while for it to come out. This is why people who suffer terrible traumatic experiences in childhood, their brains fragment those memories in ways that they can't consciously access them. But they feel them in their bodies, it remains in their nervous system, and then later in life some of those memories come back. That's what happened to me. And once the memories come back, they can either re-trigger your trauma, or you can go through some kind of therapy and integrate them into a narrative of life, and then they're not traumatic anymore. They're just memories of a bad time. But it takes a while for that to happen, and it can't happen right away. Your brain doesn't let that happen right away. And cultures work exactly the same way. David Carr has written about this. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a very, very powerful failure with this empire that was supposed to be the end of all national dynasties. And then that empire comes to an end. So what does it mean? Mm-hmm. And it takes a while to come to terms with that. Mm-hmm. So that's my answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm okay, guys. Don't worry. I'm like happy. I crack lots of jokes, and I watch Ren and Stimpy, and it's everything's fine. Okay.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I'm looking forward to the book. I'm wondering about, I guess I'd probably call it the increasing development of monotheism. I don't think it emerges or begins, but certainly it's in the Persian period, monotheism strengthens. And I'm wondering how demonology may or may not be, and especially the reorientation of demons, might be related to the increasing primacy and development of monotheism. If that works at all.
I think it must. I honestly haven't really worked through that sufficiently. I have thought about it, because I think that's like one of the big questions in our field, like what is the impact of the slow shift to monotheism, and when do we actually see it? And I agree with you. Like by the Persian period, we start seeing a tilt towards monotheism. We don't see it completely. It's not like a fundamental characteristic of all Jewishness everywhere. In fact, not Michael Stone. I can't remember who it was. There was a great paper that was presented at a conference. Mike Siegel made the case that the book of Daniel does not reflect monotheism. And that even though monotheism has built up a lot of steam by the 2nd century BCE, it doesn't mean that every Jew has accepted it. And I think Seth Schwartz, in his book on imperialism and Jewish society, also makes this case that there's a kind of nominal deference to one Jewish God, but most Jews are just like Romans of the Jewish persuasion, and Roman concepts of the numinous and the divine factor into typical Jewish thought. And it's not until the Roman Christianization of Palestine that rabbinic concepts of monotheism start to become more widely adopted in the Jewish world. I think he makes a pretty good point with that. So I do think it's a process, but I do agree with you that in the Persian period we start to see a tilt towards monotheism, and that must raise all kinds of questions about how and why God doesn't have demons at his beck and call anymore by the time we get into the New Testament literature. So I think you're right about that, and I'd be happy to talk about it more. Maybe we'll talk about it more over the conference as well. I think it's a really fruitful avenue of inquiry.
I always wonder if it's related to theodicy. Like increased monotheism means increased demons, because you have to account for if one God is in charge, all-knowing, all-powerful, there has to be a reason why bad things happen. So that's how, at least I found it to be the best explanation, but it's still really complicated, because how does that contribute to definition of...
It creates a home for these other gods. So now that you've created levels of these divine beings that you don't see, so if you have one God, you can't get just... Why did Egyptian monotheism not take hold? Because you disrupted the whole system too much. But if you demote certain gods to these demon levels, where they're not the main god, it makes it easier to cultural transition. It's easier to accept, like, oh, that's there too, but it has a different role.
And also, angels are also popping up. Like, this is where we get Michael and Gabriel. These are our first references occurring at the exact same time. So there is an order and a specificity to it, rather than generic categories, so that you can use them to answer the question of theodicy.
Yes, Alex.
You mentioned how in the Achaemenid myth we have the fulfillment of all empires in the Achaemenid Empire. Do you also see this as like the crumbling of this myth as precipitating the interest in eschatology that we start seeing in this period as well?
Oh, yeah.
Is that developed here before?
Oh, yeah, I mentioned it a little bit, but there's a really good article by Robert Rollinger about this. And he talks about it with respect to a late Achaemenid emperor, Artaxerxes III. If you send me an email, I'll send you that article, and I think that'll be really helpful. But yeah, I absolutely agree. Like the Persian eschatology was basically, well, this is it. This is the end, and it's great. And then suddenly it wasn't great. So is it really the end? And if it's not the end, when can we expect the end? I mean, this becomes part of the new framework that the old framework leads to, because the old framework is broken. So I think you're right. I think that's why we start seeing much more eschatological speculation at that point. You're welcome.
Yeah, Laura.
I have a question that touches on something that you said earlier in your talk when you were talking about the role of cognitive science in your research. And you noted that you said something along the lines of that social institutions are like the body of society. Mm-hmm. I wonder, I would just be interested in hearing more specifically how you're making that jump, right, from the level of, because so much of what you were talking about is about the physicality of the body, and the physicality of the individual response. Mm-hmm. And so sort of what the middle ground between that and institutions is.
It's really the interface between individual and community. Like the things that we do with our bodies are largely biological. The things that we do with our bodies with other people are social. So the biological and the social leads to the cultural. And so it's sort of like a chain reaction in a sense. But a lot of it really is just about monumental architecture. It's about the materiality of text. It's about the ambulatory experience of ritual. So the actual bodily movement or physical edifices become part of a framework that is experienced not just by you, but by you, me, and everybody else in the room, and that's how the cultural cognition operates. But it's still bodily, right? It's still physical. It's still about our perception of light and dark and sound.
So it's the institutions that I'm actually interested in, right? And it's the question about how this gets translated into an institutional framework that I would love to sort of hear if you know more about either people who are working on that, right? Because I'm totally with you on what you just said, right? That there's these collective experiences, but then how that gets translated into the type of institutions that we then see being so prominent in the post-Achaemenid period.
Oh, gee, that's a really good question, and I didn't really address that question in the book, but it's a really fruitful, like, it would be a really nice sort of companion piece to what I did talk about in the book, because the book is mostly about text and text production. It's less about like the social institutions of Persian period Judaism, but it could very easily, like, if I wasn't inclined to write something else for my next project, I could very easily like expand it in that direction, because I think what you're talking about is a really important way of coming up with a kind of like a tangible social context for this literary material. And I wish I could tell you more, but I just don't know yet. But I do know that there are people working on it. There's a scholar named Doug Hofstetter, I think, at Indiana University, who deals with culture and cognition. And he talks a lot about some of this stuff too. But I have a couple papers from him. If you send me an email, I'll send them to you. Okay, you're welcome. I think that's it. Oh no, here we go.
What you're saying earlier about monotheism, where is that coming from then? Because, in the contemporary culture, we think of Judaism as sort of being progenitor of monotheism, but where was it coming from at the time to impact Judaism? And also the apocalyptic literature. Is all of it flowing, in your opinion, from the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire?
Oh, good question.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
culturally, is it just a continuation into the New Testament? The apocalypse is always coming just down the road?
I think to a certain degree we can say that, but of course there are complicating factors. Once apocalyptic literature becomes a thing, it becomes its own thing, and it starts to develop its own momentum, and suddenly it becomes a genre that you choose to write in because you want a particular audience to react to your literature in a particular way, right? So I think that's part of the reason why it sustains itself for so long, and is attested, I think, pretty prominently in the biblical literature as well. With respect to monotheism, I just think it takes, in some ways, it's almost like social or intellectual natural selection. How do you survive best? And for Judaism to evolve to become radically monotheistic must have been some kind of adaptive response. And there must have been things that generated these adaptive responses. Because I just don't think it happens on its own. And it's certainly not a thing that people like sit in a committee and say, should we be monotheistic or not? Fred, what do you think? I mean, it would be great if we find a document where, thus Fred saith to all of his buddies. But it's not like that, right? I do think it's more organic in terms of the way it grows and develops from generation to generation, from imperial circumstance to imperial circumstance. I do think a real big part of it is what Schwartz talks about in his book, that the Christianization of Roman Palestine led to a sort of like, oh crap, what do we do now? And then the adoption of a radically monotheistic perspective becomes much more intensified in common Jewish practice. I do think it's much older than that, but it might not have been common. And I think
like Christianity is pushing back against Judaism with the monotheism of Christ and all the polytheistic religions around them, like this becomes identified.
In a way, but I think it moves in a slightly different direction, because what happens is, and I think Schwartz is right about this, when you are a Jew living in Roman Palestine, there's 30 other kinds of people living in Roman Palestine. You're just one minority among many minorities. And, you can be a little bit more laissez-faire about your customs and ancestral traditions because they are what they are. When you are suddenly a Jew living in Christian Roman Palestine, and all these other groups have adopted Christianity as part of the imperial project, but your community hasn't, then suddenly you're the only minority. Or at least, from one perspective, you're the only minority. And that has to affect the way that you understand the world, the way that you understand your deity in the world. And as mentioned earlier, deities are not supernatural. Deities are ordinary part of normal human experience throughout most religious traditions. I think it's only been in the modern period that we have sort of bifurcated like the miraculous from the ordinary. And I'm not saying that there isn't a division between sacred and profane, but sacred things were also in some way common things. Holiness was something that you could if the temple was right there, that's the source of holiness. And you can see it, you can pass by it, you can go into it to a certain degree. It's not something separate from your ordinary, regular existence. And I think when you have Rome and Palestine becoming Christian, or the Christianization of that area affects almost everybody, that had to affect the way Jews understood their relationship to the rest of the world, which affected the way Jews understood their relationship to God. And there's much more that we could talk about with that too. Sure.
So we have time for me for one more question.
If there's not, can I close with a joke?
Sure, yes.
Okay. So this was told to me by my thesis director, Brian Peckham of blessed memory. Peckham was a Jesuit priest, brilliant scholar, student of Frank Moore Cross at Harvard, but also, a pretty faithful guy. I think if a Jesuit priest tells you a Jesus joke, you can tell other people the Jesus joke. So this is how it goes. So Jesus goes back to heaven after his resurrection and being on earth for a while, and people witness the great miracle, and he's back up in heaven, and the angels gather around him, and they're so glad that he's back. And Jesus, welcome back. What can we do for you? You've done such great work on earth. And Jesus says, well, since I became Messiah, I lost touch with my earthly family, and I never got a chance to say goodbye to my earthly father Joseph. And one of the angels says, well, how can we help you? He goes, well, he'd be dead by now, so he's up here, and I'd really like to see him. And the angels say, well, what does he look like? And Jesus goes, well, he'd be pretty old. He was a carpenter. And one of the angels goes, there was a guy matching that description that came in just the other day. Why don't you go check that cloud over there? So Jesus hops over to the next cloud. There's, lo and behold, an old man looking very forlorn, staring down at the world beneath his feet. Jesus comes up behind him and says, I'm looking for my earthly father. And the old man, without even looking up, goes, I'm looking for my earthly son. And Jesus sits down next to him and says, well, you see, I wasn't born of natural human means. And the old man looks at him and he goes, well, neither was my son. Now Jesus is really excited. And he stands up and he goes, my father was a carpenter. And the old man stands up and he goes, I was a carpenter. And they look at each other and they hug each other and they're jumping up and down. And Jesus goes, Dad. And the old man goes, Pinocchio.
Oh. I did not see that coming.
No.
I was like, where is this? Oh, no.
Now
I
you
like
got
that.
it. Yeah. There you go.
On that Pinocchio,
Pinocchio.
I'm never gonna see that again. But just saying, let's thank Professor Leuchter for his.
Thanks everybody. This was great. I really enjoyed it.